You know, when it comes to Christianity, rituals can be one of the biggest and maybe most misunderstood dividing lines. Why do we even have them? And the bigger question is, where do they actually come from? Today, we're going to dive deep into one perspective on this really complex theological question. Okay, so let's start with a stereotype I think we've all heard. On one side, you have Catholicism, right? We picture it as ancient, full of liturgy, very hierarchical. And on the other side, you've got Protestantism, which gets framed as contemporary, spontaneous. Maybe you're picturing smoke machines and electric guitars. The whole vibe is that one is old and complicated, and the other is new and simple.
But is that really the core of the disagreement? Is it just a matter of having more rituals versus having fewer? Well, the source we're looking at today argues that this popular idea misses the point completely. The real debate, it says, is much, much deeper.
So before we even get to the conflict, the source we're digging into makes a kind of surprising point. Rituals themselves are not the problem. Actually, from this perspective, they're a good and even necessary part of faith. The case for rituals here really boils down to three key ideas. First, you just can't avoid them. Every single faith practice has some kind of structure, whether it's a super formal liturgy or just a simple 4 songs and a sermon setup. Second, they're all over the Bible. God set up rituals in the Old Testament, and Jesus himself gave the church practices like baptism and the Lord's Supper. And finally, people are actually hungry for them. In our kind of chaotic modern world, a lot of people are searching for the substance and meaning that a well-ordered ritual can bring.
So, okay, if rituals are good, then what's the danger? This is a point where pretty much all Christian traditions can find some common ground. The real enemy isn't the ritual itself, but empty ritualism.
Empty ritualism is what happens when a practice, and it can be any practice, stops pointing beyond itself to the gospel and becomes the very thing you put your trust in. And listen, this isn't just a high church problem. The source makes it clear that even something like reciting a specific sinner's prayer can become an empty ritual if your faith is in the words you're saying instead of the one you're actually praying to.
All right, so everyone can agree, good rituals, good. Empty rituals, bad. So where's the actual dividing line? Let's get into the core conflict presented in our source, this critical distinction between rituals that are divine versus those that are man-made. Now, it is absolutely crucial that we get this definition right. A man-made ritual is not just any old tradition that humans came up with. Of course, they all involve human decisions. According to the source, the real problem pops up when human traditions are passed off as if they are divine commands, putting them on the exact same level as Scripture itself. This, it's argued, is the very thing Jesus was confronting with the Pharisees.
You know, C.S. Lewis had this fantastic way of describing two opposite dangers for the Christian faith. One, he said, was the faith dying out in a desert, but the other was the faith being smothered in a jungle. From the perspective of our source, the concern with some Catholic traditions is this jungle, a massive growth of beliefs and practices that can potentially hide the core message.
To make this way less abstract and a lot more concrete, the source lays out 5 specific examples of what it considers to be man-made rituals that have been elevated to divine status inside Catholicism. Let's walk through them.
First up, the sacraments. Catholicism defines 7 of them, but this viewpoint argues that only 2, that's baptism and the Lord's Supper, were directly started by Christ himself. The claim here is that the number 7 was a later development, something you don't really see in the first 1,000 years of the Church.
Second, priestly celibacy. The perspective here argues that this man-made requirement actually contradicts Scripture, which lists husband of one wife as a qualification for church leaders. The suggestion is that for the early clergy, being married was totally the norm.
Third on the list, devotion to Mary. Now, the source is really clear that Protestants absolutely honor Mary as unique and blessed. The concern, though, is with what it calls the hugely expanded role for Mary that developed over centuries, through dogmas, special feast days, and apparitions. The argument is that this wasn't really part of the original apostolic faith and can sometimes overshadow the central role of Christ as the one and only mediator.
Number 4 is prayer to saints. And the argument here is pretty straightforward. When you look at the hundreds and hundreds of prayers recorded in the Bible, they are always directed to God. The source contends that there are just no examples of anyone, not Moses, not David, not the apostles, praying to saints who have passed away for their help. This practice, it's argued, grew gradually over church history instead of being part of the faith from the very beginning.
And the final example, which this source considers the most concerning, is the sacrament of confession to a priest for mortal sins. The argument isn't against confessing sin at all, but against this very specific form where a priest performs a judicial act of absolution. The claim is that this second plank, as it's sometimes called, after baptism, just isn't found in Scripture and wasn't the practice in the early church.
So, after looking at those 5 examples, what's the big picture here? Well, according to this view, this isn't just some academic squabble. This whole distinction between a divine command and a human tradition is the very foundation for the Protestant principle of reform.
Of course, the most common comeback to all this is, hang on a second, don't Protestant churches have plenty of man-made traditions of their own? And you know what? The source says absolutely they do. But, it argues, there's a fundamental difference.
And here it is. This is the key difference, according to this perspective. It's not about having man-made traditions. It's about whether those traditions claim to be infallible. When a ritual is presented as a divine, unchangeable command, it basically creates a closed system. The argument is that because Protestant traditions don't claim that kind of divine authority, they always remain open to being tested and even reformed by Scripture.
The historian Philip Schaff really summarized the ultimate Protestant concern perfectly. The fear is of a system that, while claiming to uphold both Scripture and tradition, ultimately puts the Church's authority in a position where it's the infallible judge over both of them, and that effectively silences Scripture if the two ever come into conflict.
And this leaves us with the central question at the very heart of this entire debate, a question that really every believer has to wrestle with. In our own faith, in our own practice, how do we tell the difference between what God has commanded and what humans have created?